I created this video because I was shocked by how the narrative of Joseph Laroche was completely ignored in the sinking of the Titanic. The year is 1912. The Titanic sinks beneath the waves, a symbol of hubris and fragility. Yet a more insidious evil grips the world, one less visible but far more devastating: racism. Across the globe, from the bustling streets of New York to the sun-drenched plains of Africa, a system of racial hierarchy reigns. This system, deeply entrenched in law and custom, dictates the lives of millions. It determines their opportunities, their freedoms, and their very worth. The year 1912 marks a pivotal moment in history, a time of great technological advancement and social upheaval. Yet, for people of color, it is a year marked by oppression, segregation, and violence. In the United States, Jim Crow laws solidify a system of racial apartheid. Across the Atlantic, European colonialism tightens its grip on Africa and Asia, exploiting resources and subjugating entire populations. In Australia, the White Australia policy slams the door shut on non-European immigration. And in Canada, the Indian Act relegates indigenous populations to the margins of society. The world of 1912 is a world divided, a world where race determines destiny. Can you imagine a world where your skin color dictates where you can live, work, and even love? This was the reality for people of color in 1912. From the Americas to Africa, Asia, and Australia, systems of racial segregation and discrimination were deeply entrenched. The color line was not merely a social construct, it was codified in law and enforced with brutal efficiency. In the United States, the Jim Crow South stood as a stark example of this legalized racism. Black Americans faced daily humiliation and violence, denied basic rights and opportunities. Lynchings, a horrific form of racial terror, cast a long shadow over the land. In the eyes of the law and often in the eyes of society, black lives were cheap, expendable. Across the Atlantic, European colonialism held sway over vast swathes of Africa and Asia. Here, the color line manifested in the brutal exploitation of colonized peoples. Forced labor, land dispossession, cultural suppression were the tools of empire. The myth of European superiority served as justification for the subjugation of millions. Even in nations like Australia and Canada, with their own histories of colonization and racial tension, the color line remained starkly drawn. Policies like the White Australia policy aimed to restrict non-European immigration, preserving a white Anglo-Saxon identity. Indigenous population continued to face systemic discrimination, their lands and cultures under threat. The world of 1912 was a world of color lines, dividing humanity into categories of superior and inferior. These divisions were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate policies and ideologies that sought to maintain white supremacy. Understanding this historical context is essential for comprehending the ongoing struggle for racial justice that continues to this day.
In the United States, the year 1912 marked a time of deepening racial segregation and discrimination. The South, still scarred by the wounds of the Civil War, clung fiercely to its system of white supremacy. Jim Crow laws, a web of legal codes and social customs, enforced a rigid racial hierarchy. These laws dictated every aspect of life for Black Americans, from the cradle to the grave. Public spaces were strictly segregated. Whites-only signs adorned water fountains, restrooms, and restaurants. Black Americans were relegated to separate and often inferior facilities. Schools, hospitals, and even cemeteries were divided along racial lines. The message was clear: Black people were not welcome in white spaces. This enforced segregation was not merely a matter of inconvenience. It was a deliberate attempt to dehumanize and subjugate Black Americans. It was a constant reminder of their second-class status. The psychological toll of living under such a system was immeasurable. The denial of basic human rights was compounded by the ever-present threat of violence. Black men, women, and even children lived in fear of being falsely accused, abducted, and murdered by white mobs. Law enforcement often turned a blind eye, and sometimes even participated in these acts of brutality. The Jim Crow South was a land of fear and oppression for Black Americans. Yet, even in the face of such adversity, they refused to be silenced. Seeds of resistance were being sown, laying the groundwork for the civil rights struggles of the decades to come.
The year 1912 witnessed not only the height of European colonialism, but also the stirrings of resistance against it. Across the colonized world, people were rising up against the injustices of foreign rule, demanding self-determination and an end to racial discrimination. From the bustling streets of Cairo to the rural villages of Vietnam, the flames of anti-colonial sentiment were being fanned. In China, the Qing dynasty had fallen just a year earlier, replaced by a nascent republic struggling to assert its independence. The new government faced immense challenges, including foreign interference, economic instability, and internal divisions. The Chinese people, weary of foreign domination, yearned for a return to strength and prosperity. Even within the heart of the British Empire, Ireland seethed with discontent. The Irish people had long chafed under British rule, and the demand for home rule had gained momentum. The year 1912 saw mass protests and political maneuvering, setting the stage for the tumultuous events that would unfold in the coming years. The world of 1912 was a world in flux, a world where the old order was being challenged by new ideas and aspirations. The forces of nationalism, anti-colonialism, and racial consciousness were converging, setting the stage for a century of upheaval and change. The struggle for equality and justice had begun, and it would not be easily quelled.
The ashes of the First World War were still settling as the world grappled with the colossal loss of life and the shattered remnants of empires. In 1919, the League of Nations emerged from the ruins, a beacon of hope for a world yearning for peace and stability. Yet, this fledgling organization, tasked with preventing future conflicts, bore the taint of the very racism that had fueled the global conflict. The League's Covenant, a document meant to enshrine international cooperation and diplomacy, was notably silent on the issue of racial equality. Despite the pleas of Japan and other nations, the Western powers led by Britain and the United States refused to include a clause condemning racial discrimination. This omission spoke volumes about the prevailing attitudes of the time. The League's structure further reflected the prevailing racial hierarchy. The permanent members of the Council, the body vested with the most power, were all European nations. Colonized peoples and those deemed non-white were relegated to the periphery, their voices often unheard and their concerns dismissed. This institutionalized racism within the League of Nations had far-reaching consequences. It legitimized the continuation of colonial rule, as the League granted mandates to European powers to administer territories seized from defeated empires. It also undermined the League's credibility in addressing issues of racial injustice, such as the treatment of minorities in Europe and the plight of those living under colonial domination. The League of Nations, envisioned as a force for peace and progress, became yet another arena where the color line divided humanity. Its failure to address the scourge of racism would have profound implications for the decades to come, contributing to the tensions and conflicts that would shape the 20th century.
As the world rebuilt from the devastation of war, millions sought new beginnings, fleeing persecution, poverty, and the spectre of violence. Yet for many, the dream of a better life was shattered against the hard reality of discriminatory immigration policies that reflected the pervasive racism of the era. The gates of opportunity were often slammed shut, based solely on the color of one's skin. The United States, a nation built on the backs of immigrants, erected barriers to entry that disproportionately impacted people of color. The Chinese Exclusion Act, first enacted in 1882, remained in effect, barring Chinese laborers from entering the country and denying citizenship to those already residing within its borders. This act, rooted in racist fears and economic anxieties, had a devastating impact on Chinese communities in America. Further restrictions, such as the Immigration Act of 1924, established quotas based on national origin, heavily favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while severely limiting those from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. These quotas reflected a desire to preserve a white, Anglo-Saxon America, a sentiment fueled by racist theories of eugenics and fears of racial contamination. Across the globe, similar policies were enacted, reflecting a global trend of racial exclusion. Australia's White Australia policy, implemented in 1901, effectively barred non-European immigration, aiming to maintain a white, British-descended population. Canada, while not as explicitly racist in its policies, nonetheless implemented measures that made it difficult for non-Europeans to immigrate. These discriminatory immigration policies had profound and lasting consequences. They shaped the demographic landscape of nations, often creating stark racial and ethnic divisions. They fueled prejudice and discrimination, as newcomers were often viewed with suspicion and hostility, and they denied countless individuals and families the opportunity to build a better life, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality.
Across the globe, individuals and organizations rose to challenge the status quo, demanding equality, justice, and an end to discrimination. Despite the pervasive racism that defined the era, the seeds of resistance were being sown in 1912 and beyond.
In the United States, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, emerged as a leading voice in the fight against racial injustice. From the bustling cities of the United States to the rural villages of India, the fight for racial equality was gaining momentum.
Through legal challenges, lobbying efforts, and public awareness campaigns, the NAACP sought to dismantle Jim Crow laws, secure voting rights for Black Americans, and combat racial violence.
Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence, coupled with his unwavering commitment to social justice, resonated far beyond India's borders, influencing civil rights movements around the world.
Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association advocated for Black economic empowerment, racial pride, and a return to Africa. In the United States, Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican-born activist, galvanized the Black community with his message of Black nationalism and self-reliance.
These movements, while diverse in their approaches and ideologies, shared a common goal: to dismantle systems of racial oppression and create a more just and equitable world. While Garvey's vision of a separate Black nation proved controversial, his message of Black pride and self-determination resonated deeply with many.
Their struggle, often met with fierce resistance and brutal repression, laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century and beyond.
The year 1914 brought with it the cataclysm of World War I, a global conflict that would reshape the geopolitical landscape and expose the deep fissures of racial inequality that ran through the heart of the world. As nations mobilized their armies, millions of men from across the globe were drawn into the vortex of war, their lives forever altered by the horrors they would witness and the sacrifices they would be forced to make. Yet, even amidst the shared experience of war, the color line held firm. Colonial troops, recruited from the far reaches of empires, found themselves fighting for a cause that often seemed at odds with their own experiences of oppression and subjugation. These soldiers, hailing from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, were often relegated to support roles, denied the same recognition and opportunities afforded to their white counterparts. The contributions of these colonial soldiers were often overlooked or minimized in official accounts of the war. Their sacrifices on the battlefields of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa were rarely acknowledged, their stories relegated to the margins of history. Yet their presence in the trenches and on the front lines challenged the very notion of European superiority, exposing the hypocrisy of a system that preached equality while perpetuating racial hierarchies. The propaganda of the time further reinforced these divisions, often portraying non-white soldiers as savage, uncivilized, and incapable of the same bravery and discipline as their white counterparts. Such racist stereotypes served to dehumanize the enemy and justify the brutality of war, while simultaneously reinforcing existing power structures and racial prejudices. In the aftermath of World War I, as the world grappled with the trauma of conflict and the challenges of rebuilding, a dangerous ideology gained traction, fueled by the embers of racism and nationalism that the war had fanned into flame: eugenics. This pseudoscience, rooted in the misguided belief that human traits were determined by heredity and that certain races were inherently superior to others, found fertile ground in the post-war period. Eugenics advocates, often cloaked in the mantle of scientific authority, argued that society could be improved by encouraging the reproduction of those deemed fit and discouraging or even preventing the reproduction of those deemed unfit. This dangerous ideology, with its chilling echoes of social Darwinism, had far-reaching consequences influencing social policy, immigration laws, and even medical practices. In the United States, eugenics fueled the passage of forced sterilization laws, targeting individuals deemed feeble-minded, immoral, or otherwise undesirable. These laws, often disproportionately applied to people of color, immigrants, and the poor, resulted in the sterilization of tens of thousands of individuals without their consent, leaving a legacy of trauma and injustice that continues to reverberate to this day. Across the Atlantic, Nazi Germany embraced eugenics with horrifying zeal, twisting its tenets to justify the mass murder of millions during the Holocaust. Jews, Roma, people with disabilities, and other groups deemed undesirable were systematically persecuted and exterminated, a chilling testament to the dangers of unchecked racism and the perversion of science for ideological ends. The rise of eugenics in the post-World War I era serves as a stark reminder of the enduring power of racist ideologies and the importance of vigilance in combating pseudoscience and prejudice in all its forms. The legacy of eugenics, with its roots in the racism of the early 20th century, continues to haunt the world. A cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing hatred and intolerance to fester unchecked.
Despite the pervasive racism and violence that characterized the early 20th century, the flame of resistance, ignited in the years leading up to World War I, continued to burn brightly.
Across the globe, individuals and communities rose to challenge the status quo, demanding equality, dignity, and an end to oppression.
In the United States, the NAACP continued its tireless work, challenging discriminatory laws, advocating for educational opportunities, and combating racial violence. From the bustling streets of Harlem to the rural villages of India, the fight for racial justice gained momentum.
The Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of black art, literature, and music, celebrated black identity and challenged racist stereotypes, giving voice to a generation determined to define itself on its own terms.
Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, with its emphasis on truth, love, and nonviolence, resonated far beyond India's borders, inspiring civil rights activists around the world.
The movement's call for self-determination, economic empowerment, and cultural pride resonated deeply with those who had endured centuries of exploitation and subjugation. The Pan-African movement, led by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, sought to unite people of African descent across the globe in a common struggle against colonialism, racism, and oppression.
The years following World War I were a time of both turmoil and transformation, a period marked by both the resurgence of old prejudices and the emergence of new movements for social justice. The year 1912 may have painted a bleak picture of a world divided by race, but even in the darkest corners, sparks of resistance flickered. Brave individuals, unwilling to accept the status quo, rose to challenge the prevailing narratives of racial superiority and injustice.
These early voices, though often drowned out by the clamor of prejudice, laid the groundwork for future generations to dismantle the edifice of racism. One such beacon of hope was W.E.B. Du Bois, a towering intellect and tireless advocate for the rights of African Americans.
A sociologist, historian, and Pan-Africanist, Du Bois co-founded the NAACP and used his pen as a weapon against racism, eloquently articulating the plight of black people in America and demanding equality and justice. His seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, exposed the psychological toll of racism and challenged white supremacy with intellectual rigor and moral clarity.
Across the globe, in India, another visionary leader emerged to challenge the tyranny of colonialism, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Armed with his philosophy of satyagraha, truth force or non-violent resistance, Gandhi ignited a mass movement for independence from British rule.
His unwavering belief in the power of non-violent resistance to dismantle unjust systems, coupled with his message of unity and self-reliance, resonated deeply with millions of Indians, inspiring them to rise up against colonial oppression.
These early voices of dissent, though separated by geography and circumstance, shared a common thread, a steadfast belief in the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings, regardless of race. Their courage to challenge the status quo, to speak truth to power, and to inspire others to action ignited a flame of resistance that would continue to burn brightly throughout the 20th century and beyond.
While individual voices bravely challenged racist ideologies, it was the collective power of organized movements that began to chip away at the foundations of racial injustice. The power of the collective organization's rise.
Recognizing that the fight for equality required a united front, individuals banded together, forming organizations dedicated to dismantling systems of oppression and advocating for social change.
Comprised of both black and white activists united in their commitment to racial justice, the NAACP adopted a multi-pronged approach, challenging discriminatory laws in court, advocating for educational opportunities for African Americans, and combating racial violence through public awareness campaigns and legal action. In the United States, the NAACP, founded in 1909, emerged as a leading force in the fight for civil rights.
Their landmark victory in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case, which declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional, marked a turning point in the civil rights movement.
Initially focused on achieving equal rights for educated Africans, the ANC's mission broadened over time to encompass the dismantling of the entire apartheid system. Across the Atlantic, in South Africa, the African National Congress, or ANC, founded in 1912, mobilized against the increasingly oppressive system of racial segregation known as apartheid.
Through protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience campaigns, the ANC, under the leadership of figures like Nelson Mandela, kept the flame of resistance burning throughout the 20th century, ultimately achieving victory with the dismantling of apartheid in 1994.
These organizations, along with countless others that emerged during this period, understood that the fight against racism was not merely about changing individual hearts and minds, but about dismantling the systems and structures that perpetuated inequality.
Their efforts, often met with fierce resistance and brutal repression, laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for racial justice.
The year 1912 stands as a stark reminder of a world grappling with the deeply ingrained sin of racism. Across continents, from the segregated south of the United States to the colonized lands of Africa and Asia, the color line defined the lives of millions, dictating their opportunities, their freedoms, and their very humanity. The journey towards racial equality was still in its infancy. A long and arduous road ahead, yet even amidst the darkness, seeds of hope were being sown. Brave individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois dared to challenge the prevailing narratives of racial superiority, their voices rising above the din of prejudice to demand justice and equality. Organizations like the NAACP and the ANC emerged as powerful forces for change, mobilizing communities to dismantle systems of oppression and fight for a more just world. The path towards racial equality has been a winding one, marked by both triumphs and setbacks. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s shattered the legal foundations of segregation in the United States, while the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa in 1994 signaled a victory against institutionalized racism. Yet the legacy of these struggles, the echoes of past injustices, continue to reverberate in the present. The fight for racial equality is far from over. Systemic racism continues to permeate institutions, shaping policies and practices that perpetuate inequality. Implicit bias, unconscious prejudices that influence our thoughts and actions continues to shape interactions and opportunities. The struggle for a truly just and equitable world where the color of one's skin no longer determines their destiny remains an ongoing and urgent task. If you found this video insightful, please like and subscribe to support our channel and stay updated on future content. As we reflect on the legacy of 1912, we are confronted with the sobering reality that the fight for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint. The echoes of past injustices reverberate in the present, reminding us that the struggle for equality requires constant vigilance, unwavering commitment, and a willingness to challenge injustice wherever it arises. The systemic racism that defined the early 20th century may have morphed and adapted, but it persists in insidious ways. Disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, and representation in positions of power all point to the enduring legacy of racial inequality. The over-representation of people of color in the criminal justice system, from arrest rates to sentencing disparities, exposes the deep-seated biases that continue to plague our society. The fight for racial equality is not merely about righting past wrongs. It is about creating a future where all individuals have an equal opportunity to thrive. It's about dismantling systems of oppression that limit potential and perpetuate cycles of poverty and disadvantage. It is about creating a world where the color of one's skin no longer determines their life chances or their access to opportunity. The journey towards a more just and equitable world requires a collective effort. It demands that we confront our own biases, challenge systems of oppression, and amplify the voices of those who have been marginalized. It calls for empathy, understanding, and a willingness to listen to and learn from the experiences of others. It is a journey that we must undertake together for the sake of our shared humanity and the promise of a brighter future.